Okay. Hi, Paul. It's really good to speak to you again.
Hi again. How are you doing?
I'm really good, thanks. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Feeling more relaxed.
Excellent. It's been a few days since we last spoke. I think the first thing on most people's minds if they saw the first video is going to be, is there an update on your equipment?
Yeah. Have I got my equipment yet? Unfortunately, the answer is no, not yet.
Okay.
So it's still, I think the equipment is still sitting in Mexico City. I'm still sitting in Cancun. But I've been talking to one company who've been really helpful, who might be able to just ship the equipment straight to the US without me, which makes me a tiny bit nervous because I want to just be holding it in my arms. But still, that's better than nothing. And I mean, the worst case scenario is that equipment doesn't get back to me at some point. So just sort of desperate for that to happen at any way possible. But hopefully you can have a meeting about it tomorrow, actually. So maybe there'll be some updates then. Fingers crossed, please.
Well, absolutely. We are all going to be keeping our fingers very much crossed for you. I know I certainly will. So we talked a little bit in our first interview about you going to board a ship in the US. It's a ship containing liquid natural gas, is that right?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and you're going to be measuring methane emissions from that ship. So tell me a bit about what you're ultimately looking for from this piece of research.
So there's a few things that we're looking for from the research. So the things that we want to get out of this is, well, first, as I think I mentioned the first time around, this is a sort of first of a kind study. And I think what we're trying to gauge is how do you actually measure methane emissions on a ship? How can you do that effectively? So it's a bit of a trial. It's a bit of a sort of pilot study to work out what's the best way of doing it. Because as we were saying before, it's a bit expensive and there are lots of different types of sources of emissions that you might see. We just don't know. So for example, you might see emissions mainly coming from the engine. You might see emissions coming from the process plants that they've got actually on the ship, or you might see them coming off the storage vents. There's a bunch of places that you could see. We just don't really know. So what we're hoping for, firstly, is to say, well, how are we actually going to be able to effectively measure these? And also the second thing we want to get an idea of is it a big deal? Are the emissions like significant? Is it significantly large enough for us to have to do more of an assessment? Now, the kind of one of the big problems is that so LNG carrier ships, liquefied natural gas carrier ships, there's quite a lot of them in the world. There's over 500 of them, all dotted about the place, and they are really different from each other. So there's lots of different sizes, different ages, different companies that operate them, different sort of like different regions, stuff like that. So what we're not going to say from this one study is, what's exactly the emissions that we see from all types of LNG carrier ships, because it's not going to be a representative sample, if you see what I mean. But it might give us one measurement, one measurement campaign, and it gives us an idea of how we can do it in the future. Because what we really need is to work out how can we get a representative sample. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm guessing from a research perspective and kind of future implications, let's say if you find really high methane emissions, it's going to be a big deal, because then you're going to be people are going to be thinking, right, we need to go and have a look at a more representative sample and see if this is a one-off or if this is the same across a number of ships.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And so I guess, it could, and it's the same both ways, right? If we see hardly any emissions, it doesn't mean that all the other ships don't have any emissions as well. And it's the same vice versa. If we see lots of emissions, it doesn't mean the same thing. But it gives us one starting point, and then we know that we need to do a bit more. Because I think one of the key issues is that we know, well, you know that LNG, natural gas, is a fossil fuel, right? And we do have to eliminate our usage eventually of fossil fuels. But probably out of all of the different types of fossil fuels, it's probably one of the areas that's most likely to sort of grow in terms of demand going forward, because firstly, it's sort of one of the less, it's like one of the more benign, not more benign, how do you say it? Less bad? No, it's basically what I want to say is it's sort of the lowest carbon of the fossil fuels, and so there's probably more space for us to use natural gas than there is for like coal or oil, for example. But we still need to, it's still not low carbon enough by any means. And if it works out that there's lots of methane emissions associated with it as well, then that makes it much worse. And it means that, you know, unless we get a handle on, unless we can actually reduce our methane emissions, then the role of natural gas is diminished. So it's a real requirement for us to sort of work out how bad is it and how can we improve it.
Okay, so we're thinking it's the best of a bad bunch.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, yeah. I think that's probably about right. And you know, and to be honest, you know, so there is a role for natural gas in our energy systems, right? Because it's not just about climate change. You know, we use energy, we use lots of energy. Energy demand is growing in various regions, and it provides something that's quite cheap at the moment. It provides lots of energy access. It's not just about climate change, and it's easy to sort of demonize based on that, but it has served us a really important purpose and will continue to do that. But at the same time, you know, we know much more about all this stuff now, and we know that we need to absolutely diminish our climate change emissions. So now that we know that, we can work out, well, we need a bit more of an understanding before we can work out what to do about it.
Absolutely. So I guess, you know, thinking about the types of people who might watch this and be interested, or think, you know, who should be watching this,
like my mum.
Like your mom, absolutely. Why should people care about this? And maybe more importantly, who should care about this?
I mean, this is really important in terms of, so as we were saying before, you know, we know that fossil fuels are too high carbon, and so we know that we need to reduce. So as a society, we need to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, right? But how we do that and how we sort of transition to a completely low carbon society is up for grabs, and we need to sort of have we need to have the knowledge to be able to do that. And so that's why actually as part of this study, this is something I'm quite proud of actually. As part of this study, we've got an advisory group, which is basically formed of a few interested companies and membership organisations, as well as an environmental NGO. But also we've got some sort of international sort of policy making departments. Like we've got a member from the European Commission, we've got a member from the UN Environmental Programme, we've got somebody from the US Department of Energy, from the EPA, and so I think I'm quite proud of having that as an advisory group to sort of help us to tell us what's important. And I think that's an indicator of the fact that this is an important thing that we're doing, because it's going to have an impact on how policy is, or how regulation is made to reduce these emissions. So we need to work out how bad it is first, and then we can work out, well, what can we do about it from a policy side or from a technical side, etc. So I don't know if you know about this, but something closer to home is that last year though, the EU released a big methane strategy. So that was as part of a drive to reduce the European methane emissions, and a big focus of that is understanding what we can do about all of the gas that we import. And so we import lots of gas via LNG ships. And so we're thinking, well, how do you make sure that we know what we're doing, and how do we reduce that? And so particularly this type of study is important to work out what the sort of regulation that we might need to make sure our emissions are low.
Okay, that's really incredible that it could have implications for policy?
Well, I think it's a starting point for it anyway.
It's very exciting. Can I ask a bit of an ignorant question?
Oh, please.
The liquid natural gas, are these ships transporting it, or are they using it to run, or both?
Yeah, no, that's a cool question, because the answer is both.
Okay.
So basically, the ship is basically filled with these big storage tanks of liquefied natural gas. So the point of them is to transport the gas, but one thing that they do is actually use it as a fuel to drive the ship as well.
Because
so
why wouldn't you, right?
Exactly, yeah, because it's available fuel, and because one thing that happens, how I was saying before that you have to cool it down to really low temperatures, so to minus 160 degrees, and so as you're sort of moving it, basically it sort of slightly increases in temperature, and so stuff starts to sort of boil off, and instead of emitting that to the atmosphere, they'll end up just using that as fuel, so it kind of makes it more efficient.
It really does, doesn't it?
Yeah. So and actually that's a really important thing for us, because we want to look at, well, is there any emissions coming from the engines when they're actually using it as a fuel, or is it just from the storage or somewhere else entirely? We don't know.
Absolutely, that's really amazing. So you're going to be on this ship for a month. How are you feeling about spending a month on a ship?
How am I feeling about it? I'd say quite a mix of things. I've gone through phases of so probably right now I reckon I'm 50% just desperate to get on the ship and to get started. Probably 40% nervous about it, because I've never been on a cargo ship before. Yeah, actually, sort of, yeah. I've been quite nervous about this before. I don't even know if I'm going to be seasick. Something is that I haven't worked out. What I do know is that I'm not generally that sick on transport, except when I'm on the top level of a bus. So I don't know if that's an indication. But yeah, but, who knows? Anyway, so in the final 10% is I'm just really excited. I'm just really excited about seeing what happens. I was saying, I think I was saying in the last interview that this is my first sort of leading role on a piece of research. So I'm kind of desperate for it to go well. And it's quite a complicated project with lots of moving parts, including the ship. So I'm just really don't want to do anything wrong.
Yeah, oh goodness, yeah, absolutely. I think it's really exciting as a first project. It's a pretty big first project, Paul.
Yeah.
So, bit of a question. You're traveling with bazillions amounts, excuse me, my language,
approximately,
of liquefied natural gas, right?
Yeah, about 150,000 meter cubed of
okay.
gas.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but that stuff is pretty flammable. Okay. So just tell me a bit about what you have got to do, your part in trying to make sure, given that you're trying to stop processing plants from blowing up, and teach people how to do that. What's your part in stopping this ship from blowing up, Paul?
Oh, well, that's a good question. So what's my part in stopping it from blowing up? I guess the main thing, my main role is not to my main role is not necessarily to prevent it, but I just don't want to cause it. You see what I mean? That's my
Okay.
is to be as benign as possible to the ship. But so the one thing is that I'm going to be walking around with this camera, sort of trying to detect methane emissions, right? And so actually, historically, people will have used these cameras to go and detect methane emissions to prevent, flammable atmospheres from occurring. Because if methane is leaking out, it's flammable. It could create like an explosive atmosphere. What we expect is for the emissions to be sort of pretty low, so it's not going to be really a sort of flammability explosion hazard. It's more going to be just a climate issue, if you see what I mean, because you need sort of So for something to be explosive, for methane, it has to be sort of relatively high concentrations in the air, and especially if you're on a ship, there's quite a lot of ventilation going on. So we think there's relatively low likelihood of that. But so, for example, I need to do some stuff to prevent me from causing an explosion. So one example is, let me just give me a sec.
Okay.
One example is the laptop I'm using is this big beast. Wow. If you can see how much of a beast this is. This is like an explosion-proof laptop. So so basically, if I use it in a flammable atmosphere, then it won't like cause a spark or anything like that. So all of the equipment I have to use has to be, we call it ATEX, which means it won't sort of cause a spark. So it has to be intrinsically safe. And I have to wear sort of flame-resistant clothing and stuff.
Okay, flame-resistant clothing.
Which doesn't instill me with a lot of confidence, but presumably this is just an extra measure.
I'm really hoping that's the truth.
Yeah. And I have to say that in the ship that I'm going on, I mean, I'm sure this is the same with everybody, but they're extremely on it in terms of their safety management systems. It's been amazing to see. It's so impressive how on it they are, giving you all the. So I've already had like the inductions and I'm sure there's going to be lots more and stuff, and just sort of stipulating what I can and can't do at every stage. So that gives me a bit of confidence.
Oh, fantastic. It makes me think that in a future conversation, we should definitely talk about some of the similarities between mental health risk assessment and the risk assessments that go on this ship.
That sounds good.
Absolutely. I really want to talk to you as well next time about climate crisis anxiety. I think we've probably run out of time for today, but why don't we kind of arrange to have a conversation about your thoughts on that next time?
That sounds really good, actually. Yeah, maybe before I go to the US, so maybe last time that we talked whilst I'm here, we can talk about that a bit. That sounds really good to me.
Fantastic. Okay, it's so good to see you, Paul, and I will see you very soon.
Okay, excellent. Let's play a board game soon.
Oh yeah, let's totally play a board game soon, and then go climbing.
That's the dream.
Take good care of yourself.
Bye.
Bye.